All right, 308. Welcome back, everybody. Ruth, have you rejoined the group?
Yes, it's going slow. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little bit in and out, but we can hear you.
Okay, is this better?
Mine internet's slow too, so I think we're good. I'm glad to see you, and I will let you kick off your panel on offshore wind. I see our speakers are both present, so take it away.
All right. Excuse me, everybody. I have a bit of a sinus something I brought home from Boston last week. So if I go off camera or mute, it's probably because I'm coughing. So I'm going to try to get through this, and then our panelists will do the talking. So as you know, offshore wind has been a hot topic around the IUCE community with the amount of projects that are being built in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, all the way down to the South Atlantic, depending on what you consider Mid and South Atlantic, over to California and now the Gulf of Mexico. So one of the kind of hot topics that IUCE has been playing a role in is data sharing and how can IUCE serve the public-private partnership aspect of offshore wind from the end to end, given that these are going to be 30 to 40-year projects if you consider the front end of development, which takes about 5 to 7 years to get to the permits for your projects, and then anywhere from a 33 plus operating term and then a decommissioning term. There's a lot of data collection that goes into these projects. There's also a lot of opportunities to collect data in areas that have, at least in other regions, typically have not had structures in the water, whereas the Gulf of Mexico, we've had a number of public-private partnerships around ocean observing with offshore structures, from the physical oceanography to chemical to biological monitoring. So this is an opportunity today to talk a little bit more about what does data look like for offshore wind, where can IUCE play a role, and what is a developer's perspective with data collaborations and data partnerships. So we have 3 excellent speakers today. I'm going to do a quick introduction of each of those speakers, and then they will give about a 10-minute presentation or remarks, and then we will have a moderated Q&A. Jen, do you see Joel Southall on? I don't see him.
I am on
my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Okay, just making sure I didn't see your lovely face. Good, so we have everybody here. So our first speaker will be Tashara Matthews. She has more than 14 years of regulatory experience and formerly served as the Supervisory Program Management Specialist for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. GCOOS is no stranger to BOEM, but Tashara's experience being on the program side versus the study side brings an interesting perspective to this panel. She really drove the development of the agency's first renewable programs in the region, even earned Supervisor of the Year during her time at BOEM. Now she has moved over to serve in a role WSP, who is a consultant that works with much of the offshore wind industry, but her interests are really focused in developing offshore energy restoration infrastructure and other environmental projects, and promoting strong regulatory and stakeholder outreach and policy development with a business emphasis on offshore wind and the energy transition. She's a graduate at Xavier University of Louisiana with a bachelor's degree from the University of Southern Mississippi. She's based in New Orleans. Our second speaker is certainly a friend of the GCOOS community. We've seen him around in various companies. Now he is a principal at Integral, Dr. Doolittle, Daniel Doolittle, is a broadly trained marine scientist and program manager with over 25 years of industry, government, academic research, and consulting experience. When I say a broad trained marine scientist, he specializes in marine geological, geochemical, and environmental fields. And he has a number of core competencies, including environmental and exploration consultancy, expertise in carbonate sedimentology, seeps, environmental baseline studies, seafloor habitat mapping, and technology development for seafloor remote sensing. He's served all over the world in different capacities under different projects, and more recently has supported offshore wind development in New Jersey, New York Bight, and the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area, particularly being leading the design and delivery of seasonal surveys for benthic habitats and essential fish habitats. And lastly, we have Joel Southall, who is the Manager of Environmental Affairs and Sustainability at RWE. He, in this role, works on a number of the environmental partnerships that RWE is focused on as they build offshore wind in the US. But his work also focuses on a wide range of sustainability issues, as well as mitigating environmental impacts of renewable energy projects. Prior to this, he served at a number of institutions working on sustainability, including the New England Aquarium. He received a Bachelor of Science in Biology from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And fun fact, they played Texas A&M. And I won't surprise who won. We probably all know. But after UMass, he did receive his Master's of Environmental Management from Duke University, specializing in environmental economics and policy. So he brings a wealth of knowledge from both land-based and ocean-based sustainability work, and now is really focused on data partnerships with offshore wind. So I will turn it over to Tashara, followed by Daniel, followed by Joel to open us.
All right, thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you everyone for having me this afternoon. As Ruth mentioned, I was in my former role, I was with BOEM, I was the renewable energy lead person for that role. And so if I can put on my former hat for just a second, I would like to talk about the data and the information that was needed for the Gulf of Mexico in order to identify those wind energy areas. So as we all know, data is important. That's the reason why we're here today. As we started going through the process of trying to identify the wind energy areas in the Gulf of Mexico, we reached out to NOAA because NOAA had just completed, the NCOS section group from NOAA had just completed the marine spatial planning for the aquaculture areas. And after looking at the model and the data that they had in that area, we were like, we need something very similar to this. And as we were continuing to go throughout the process of understanding the stakeholders' concerns, they kept telling us, NOAA has this really great model. We think you all should partner with, BOEM should partner with NOAA because they've already collected a lot of this data. So it made sense to make sure, we had both of us in the federal agencies at that time to partner. And so the first thing we need to do is understand what are the physical constraints. And as you know, there's a lot of oil and gas infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico. So BOEM, of course, has that data, knowing where the pipelines are, unless they have moved, and also knowing where those platforms are as well, to know where are the spaces we're actually operating in. The other thing that we had to take into account at that time was understanding any natural concerns. You have muddy slopes off of near the Mississippi. You also had some areas that were actually being restored in the Gulf of Mexico due to Deepwater Horizon. Those areas were near national wildlife refuges, and also they were areas off of the Park Service. And so taking all that into account, BOEM decided at that time to move over west of the Mississippi River because of all of that information that we had received from partners, federal partners and private partners, as well as going through this process. Once we had all this information, we felt like we had some things that were missing. And some of that was a lot of the fisheries data. After talking with several fisheries groups, we knew that we needed NOAA in order to tackle this tremendous task, because a lot of that data, as most of you all are aware, is proprietary data. And so NOAA has that information. And so working closely with them and having them to run that model was a tremendous impact on the areas that we were able BOEM was able to put out and actually have an actual auction this summer. And so it was important. The stakeholder engagement piece for the data was very important. I'm making sure that you are out there early and often speaking to these groups, seeing what data that they may have that can also contribute to this was also very helpful. So what BOEM decided at that time was, after receiving the information, was to install that 20-mile buffer, not only for the Menhaden fisheries, because we received, BOEM had received letters from that as well, but also the 20-mile buffer was also requested by some folks for shoreline birds. And so that buffer was instilled in there. The other thing is that working closely with the stakeholder groups, the fisheries, the shrimp fisheries, we were able to utilize NOAA and looking at the data, understanding where they had past fishing trends, current fishing trends, and also where trends were starting to either increase or decrease. So that was very, very key in understanding that. As we were going through having the stakeholder engagement meetings, a lot of people were concerned, well, yeah, you looked at the past history, but are you looking at areas of where fishermen are actually fishing now? And we had looked at that data. So that was very key, and also understanding where the new areas could potentially be. So after all of that, of course, was included into the model, it was ran, and then we were able to, at that time, BOEM was able to determine those wind energy areas, and I think BOEM had 13 areas. 2 were removed after working closely with DOD because of some radar concerns. But so data is very, very key, and it's also key in making sure that you're working with your stakeholders, gathering up information that we couldn't have as a federal agency possibly, but maybe they had. And so making sure all of that stuff was included into the constraints model as we were going through this process. And so I'll stop there.
Great, thank you for that perspective on data on the front end in the planning process, which I think BOEM and NOAA and GCOOS has certainly tapped into the cadastre where a lot of that public data sits. So now Daniel is going to take us into what happens when there is a project, and what does the data collection look like at the different phases of COP development of a offshore wind project.
Ruth, thank you for that, and I feel your Boston pain. I think you and I were in the same cloud of virus. Jen, can I grab the screen? I think I've reordered the slides since I sent them to you. Is that
Absolutely? You can share. You should be able to. If not, I'll make sure you become a presenter.
okay?
There you
I
go.
think that's working. Great. All right. Well, thanks everyone. And I have to admit, I had a moment of small heart attack when I first joined panel 1, and I realized, oh no, was this supposed to be a full-on science talk? So I then went back and read your instructions, Ruth, and calmed myself down. But thanks again for the time and the attention today to present a little bit about this thing that is fairly unwieldy. It's this massive amount of data collection that is done in support of achieving a NEPA process and a NEPA EIS for the development of an offshore wind farm. And you're going to hear a lot of different acronyms and things thrown around, and if it seems unfamiliar, welcome to the club. It's an emerging industry. BOEM is moving along with all of the other regulators, learning as we go, learning from projects that have been put into the water I think there's only 7 active turbines in U.S. waters at the moment. There are a number of foundations and turbine elements being put in this summer, so we're right in the middle of it. And yeah, so that's just a little bit of the introductory, setting the stage. I've been working in offshore wind since 2011, when I was seconded to a office in the Netherlands and sort of unexpectedly walked into the boom in offshore wind that Europe and the United Kingdom and the North Sea was enjoying. And then in 2016, I started working on Block Island Wind Farm, the 5 turbines that are here in Rhode Island. And then it's just sort of been the daily sustenance and air that I breathe is offshore wind. So let's see. Okay, this is a this is a very familiar graphic. Bohm has produced this. Bohm has produced a wonderful number of information to try to describe the process that developers are to go through as the project moves through the regulatory process. And there's 4 upfront or feed front end engineering and design stages, and they're shown on the top here, where it's the planning and analysis of a lease, the actual leasing process, and then the site assessment and construction and operations phase. And that's really where we're focusing today on today's discussion. The 2 yellow arrows at the bottom, they are pointing to about a 5, maybe 6 year idealized process. And there's a lot of work that goes into this, but however, it's not quite the complete picture. As Ruth commented, the timeline of a project and therefore the potential impacts, the potential stressors, the potential opportunities for study, all of the things that happen for that have to be mitigated, or opportunities for data sharing, can occur over actually a much longer time frame, and it's really anywhere from 30 to 40 years. And I really like this slide because, for one thing, it shows the acoustic impact, or the noise associated with the wind farm development, and it also kind of puts the full time scale into a nice visual graphic. Um, so there's, as while this is for acoustics or for noise, this could exist for any number of potential impacts that we have to manage and monitor. So that's that's just the key concept of those slides. The first acronym that everybody will start throwing around is the SAP and the COP, the Site Assessment Plan and the Construction and Operations Plan, are the 2 data delivery mechanisms that are required as part of the NEPA process. And Tashara, I am totally stepping on your former toes. So if
No,
I
you're
say
fine.
if I say anything that is unintelligent or not quite grabs the process, please feel free to correct me. Um, it's um, yeah. So the SAP is it's due to the regulators 1 year after the lease has been granted to the leaseholders. So RWE in the Gulf of Mexico, as soon as their lease gets signed, and maybe Joel will let us know about that, their clock is going to start ticking. They're going to have 1 year to assess, kind of at a 10,000 foot uh, degree, of what is contained within their lease area. What things are they going to need to be concerned about? So there's some light touch geological and geophysical surveys. There's light touch geohazard screening, light touch biological or environmental surveys that are done, and also some marine archaeology and cultural history surveys. So those, as the slide says, they provide the ground condition data for the permit and installation of a metocean buoy. Uh, Again, evolution. 15 years ago at Cape Wind, we thought we were going to build Met towers, and now the technology has evolved where it's floating lidar buoys are the primary forms of collecting that wind resource data and also the Met ocean data. This is also the time when there's the beginning of the stakeholder and the regulator meetings, pre-survey meetings, lots of opportunities and encouragement for interactions between BOEM as the lead federal regulator and the developer occur here. And it's not all to say that it has to be done with fresh, novel survey, freshly collected novel survey data. Desktop studies make up a big part of the SAP submission. And what BOEM is looking for is two key metrics to say, yes, this is approved, and that's data completeness and sufficiency. Those are really critical elements. And there, again, as I said in earlier comments, there are definitely new rulemaking steps in progress, and maybe folks on the line will have an update on what the energy streamlining rulemaking that's going on that addresses the SAP. So the industry is learning as we go. So lots of words, but what does some of the data look like? It's really, there's a myriad number of data types. You're going to be shocked. I think this is the beginning of a new ocean data revolution that I've not seen in my career until offshore wind came along. The quantity, the quality, the density of data, the resolution of the data, the growing openness to sharing this data. There's a lot to be optimistic about. So in the old days, we would be really happy if we got 10%, 20% overlap when we were doing multi-beam surveys or side scan sonar surveys. It's now common to have 200 or 300% overlap just to get the data density that's required by the offshore wind developers. So what we can do with that data, what's been unlocked by having such dense acoustic soundings on the seabed, is driving innovations like I've not seen before in my years. What's shown are just three examples of the SAP geophysical survey: multi-beam, backscatter, side scan sonar. It's colored here. Typically, it would be presented in the grayscale as we're used to seeing it. Magnetometer, gradiometer, sediment grab samples to ground truth everything. All of these are normally put on a single vessel and collected in order to inform the SAP, which drives the ability to get the buoy in the water. This is really the linchpin of financial decisions, of design decisions. There's usually 1 to 2 buoys that are put in a lease area because it really allows the developer to assess the resource, to actually determine how much wind can they sell or how much energy they can generate from the wind that's present over a 1 to 2 year period that they're using to measure and then to sell. This is also a great example of the beginnings of those public-private partnerships. Atlantic Shores has and Mayflower, now South Coast, they elected to put all of their wind lidar data, or most of it, I should say, up in one of the regional partnerships for IUS. So NERACOOS up in New England and MARICOOS here in the Mid-Atlantic are hosting this data as we speak. So really nice opportunity there. This just shows the track of Hurricane Henri, and it passed right over one of the lidar buoys that was supporting the South Coast wind. Then it was called Mayflower. And the data that we see here is just, H max of 8 meters as the hurricane was passing over, and wind speeds in excess of 55 knots, of 0 here up to 250 meters so the LiDAR is looking up into bends. So just another new source of data for our research uses when there are these agreements for public and private partnerships between the developers. So the SAP gets put in, the buoy gets deployed, the SAP's approved, the buoy is deployed, and then that doesn't stop things. It actually ramps up the decision to plan and design and execute and collect one of the most incredible constellations of data sets for a project that I've ever seen. And this is called the construction and operations plan. There's usually a 5-year timeline from when SAP is approved to when the COP needs to be delivered. There is a strong encouragement, almost I would say a de facto requirement for significant stakeholder engagement during those five years. And this is really the path to permitting, to getting the record of decision that allows the developer to move forward with the project. When I say the scope and breadth of the assessment, it's not kidding. It's if you'll forgive the 2001 Space Odyssey meme, the COP, if you go on the BOEM site and download it, it is full of data. It's amazing. They have been growing in size and in complexity fairly steadily. So this is pulled just from the Atlantic Shores COP for their first project, which is called Project One, or the southern part of their New Jersey lease area. It's well over 1,000 pages, and I couldn't put the number of pages together for all the appendices. These are multi-100-page reports typically. And there's over 60 of them just in that one project area. The MSIR, the Marine Site Integrated Report, the Cable Burial Risk Assessment, the CBRA, the Marine Archaeological Resources Assessment, the MARA, the Munitions of Explosive Concern or Unexploded Ordnance, the MEC UXO, the EMF, the Electromagnetic Field Assessment. All of these are employing a ton of scientists and field professionals that are field and desk-bound professionals in delivering this massive data set to be synthesized into the COP, which even in itself, that synthesis process is impressive. Now, this is just for one project. There's 27 of them ongoing on the East Coast right now, in various stages along that timeline. So just the number and the amount and the density of data is fairly phenomenal. What I'm most familiar with, as Ruth said in the opening remarks, is the benthic assessments. And this is just to show an example of some of the data inputs and the data products that come out. On the left, some of the tools for ground truthing, a towed video system, a sediment profile imaging camera, a grab sampler with a camera on it. These are all the common tools. There's also lots of opportunity for development of better tools. Scott Gallagher's HabCam, for example, those are being deployed in some resource assessments by developers to good effect. So there's definitely room to grow there. All of that data feeds into an interpretation across the southern lease site to determine various aspects that are requested by the regulators. In this case, it's National Marine Fisheries Service, looking for substrates that are supportive and important to essential fish habitats. The open crosses and the circles are just denoting the various ground truth locations. And there's some squiggly lines in there too that are the track lines of the video. Seabed and above is a big subject area of study, but also seabed and below, or mudline and below. This just shows the simple line of data also from Atlantic Shores. We're showing these because we were able to present a lot of this information at an OTC session last year. and the papers are just starting to come out. So that's where a lot of this data is being pulled from. So this just as an example of the HRG, the stratigraphy, the resulting isopac that can then be interpreted from that. To try to wrap up, the goal of these numerous COP surveys and these various data types, they're really to feed into all of these different studies and assessments that are required by NEPA. So what you're seeing with the words around the perimeter are just the different reports and the different summaries that have to come from each of those reports and studies to feed into the NEPA process. So all of the topic areas under biological resources, the geophysical, the geological, the geohazard, the physical oceanography, the med-ocean studies, those all have to define the environmental setting incredibly well. Cultural resources, physical resources. I'm leaving out a plethora of socioeconomic studies that are also fed into the COP. And just as data examples, we've shown a taste of the med-ocean data from the wind LIDAR information, the geophysical data, some of the geohazard data, and some of the environmental data. That was a whirlwind tour. I hope this provides just an appreciation of the scale and the scope of the documents primarily. And as I said, the offshore wind industry is literally built on the findings contained within these documents, and on the efforts of, I'd say, thousands of knowledge workers, offshore mariners, scientists, regulators, and countless others. So with that, thank you, and I'll hold my other comments till the discussion.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So I'd encourage people to think about their questions. I have some moderator questions that we'll ask the panel, but you kind of got that large scale look, and now we're going to dive into RWE's perspective as the first lease winner for the Gulf of Mexico, and also an active developer both in California and the East Coast. So I'll turn it over to Joel to give a little bit about who RWE is and their approach to monitoring for offshore wind.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound
Ruth,
great, Joel.
Okay, all right,
yes.
Perfect. So
Sorry,
I will, that's all good. I'm going to start off by apologizing about my IT issues. I am working remote this week and had some issues. So I have audio, but unfortunately no video. So I apologize for that. And I think Jen was going to share my slides. I'm also not able to see slides that people are sharing. So apologies for any challenges there.
Just say next, Joel, whenever Jen's got your slides up. So just say next, and I will post your picture in the chat so people can see what you look like. Okay.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Don't post the picture of me crying after UMass lost to A&M, please. So my name is Joel. Like Ruth was saying, I work for RWE, and she gave a quick bio, but just to recap, so I'm working mainly on how we look at the environmental impacts of the activities that we conduct when we develop an offshore wind farm. And so I work for RWE's offshore work in the U.S., and so that includes some other lease areas, but here mainly to talk about, obviously, Gulf of Mexico and how we're laying the groundwork for the development of that project, and really how we're thinking about all this, beyond just the development side and the monitoring side, how we come into a community, how we work with stakeholders, how we form partnerships, how we listen to people, and then how we get data, how we conduct monitoring surveys to develop data, and how we put all of those things together to inform what the project is going to end up looking like. Next. So like Ruth was saying, that RWE currently has 3 offshore wind projects in the United States. A lot of offshore wind around the rest of the world. So RWE is a 125-year-old company, started in Germany, but has a global footprint, lots of different types of energy generation with a recent push into the US. So we have a project off of in the New York Bight called Community Offshore Wind. That auction was early last year. Also are developing a project off the coast of California. That auction was late last year. That's actually where I am. So I'm in Eureka, California today, doing some stakeholder engagement for that project. But just a couple months ago, RWE was fortunate to win the auction for one of the lease areas off of in the Gulf, so the area that was off the coast of Louisiana. Next, just a couple of details about that. So that area is 44 miles off of the coast. It's in 10 to 25 meters. The area is a little over 100,000 acres. So you can see the shape there. It's the one that's sort of colored with that sort of seafoam green, I guess it is. And that's so roughly about 13 miles by 13 miles. Obviously not a perfect square, but that's the basics. And so given the area and the water depths, that would then be fixed bottom wind. So there's a couple of different foundation types which lead to different installation methods and different impacts, kind of like Daniel was saying. But at this point, we know, and I'm going to get a little bit more into the timeline in just a second, but at this point, we know just based on the area and the water depths and some other basics, that it would be fixed bottom wind. Whereas for California, because of the much deeper water there, that would be floating. So that's kind of where we are in the process for those sorts of decisions. The area would support up to 2 gigawatts of power, which equates to about 350,000 homes. And one of the reasons that we're so excited for this project is because we know that the region has excellent infrastructure and supply chain for offshore wind, both potential and also current. A lot of the work that's been done in other parts of the country for wind has come from, in one way or another, from the Gulf. And so there's a lot of that, aspects of this sort of project. There's a lot of that already in place there. We've also seen a lot of support for the growth of industries like offshore wind, and specifically in Louisiana for offshore wind in particular. Next. So this slide is a very sort of broad brush indicative slide, but I wanted to talk just how we as a developer think about the process, the project timeline, and then how specifically that relates to how we think about monitoring and data collection. And then the next slide, I'll get to a little bit about what I mean by data collection and ours versus others versus partnerships and those sorts of things. So there's two main points I want to get across here. One is just the long time frame of these kinds of projects. So like Trishar was saying earlier, I want to definitely hit on what I have down there on the left as pre-auction work. So in terms of data and coming to decisions on siting and deconflicting uses and where you have a call area that then gets winnowed down to a wind energy area that then goes into a lease, like all of the information that goes into that is incredibly significant. So even though it's on the little skinny part of my little triangle that fell over there, that's a tremendous amount of work, which A is useful for the purpose of siting, but B is useful for us still. So getting some of that information that goes into the environmental assessment document or goes into all of the filters that lead to, where that box on the map is and why it's there, that's incredibly useful for us. So I definitely want to hit on the fact that a lot of this work has already happened, and a lot of this stuff happens before a developer comes into the picture in terms of winning winning a lease auction. The other thing I want to hit on is, again, on the time, just how all of this stuff this is obviously not to scale, but it's a long time frame. And so I have in there sort of, we have an indicative operational date of mid-2030s for the Gulf of Mexico, similar for California. the project sort of development and permitting, but then all the data collection that then leads to engineering decisions that go into the COP, like Daniel was talking about. It's a pretty long process. And so the second point I want to talk about here is, as we go forward in time, we get more information on project specifics, how complete the project design is. So within the COP that Daniel was talking about, there's it's called a PDE, or a project design envelope, which is what could the project potentially look like, sort of from this tall to that tall for the turbines, or this many megawatts to that many megawatts. And so you get sort of a window which allows for an assessment of the range of impacts, but that that really throughout the whole process gets narrowed and narrowed until you get to a final decision. And as we do that, and as we A, collect more information, but then B, make those decisions on that, that allows for our monitoring plans and the way that we think about data, what data need to be collected. That allows that to mature and become a lot more specific as well. So as we move through this, we get a much more definitive idea of what the project's going to look like. So then we know what the impacts are going to look like. We know what the stressors are going to be. Daniel was talking about, different stressors at different project phases. So we have sort of the construction and the operations and maintenance and the decommissioning. It goes to those phases. It also goes to time of year. It goes to installation methods. There's a lot of things that get cross-referenced to determine what those impacts are going to be. So then what the mitigations are going to be, what time of year we do certain activities, things like that. And so then that informs what our monitoring activities look like, and what our data needs are. So next. So then putting that all together and how we think about what our programs are going to look like, what our data needs are going to be. So before I worked for RWE, I worked for that project that Daniel was mentioning, South Coast Wind. I worked for that developer for about 3 years, and started in 2020 before any construction had started in New England, and when a lot of things were still, and things are still new, but a lot really has been figured out, and there's been a lot of streamlining and improvement in the process, things like that. But when I started there, since then I've seen a good, I think, change to looking at how all of these different data streams fit together and get synthesized through partnerships to provide an overall picture. And so when I think about it, I think of all of that existing data that was used to inform the siting and our initial thinking. So things like wind yield and looking at other uses like Tertiary was talking about. So I think of that, and then I think of there's other ongoing data collection, not aimed specifically at offshore wind, but in the area that is useful for offshore wind. Then there already are, especially on the East Coast, and there will be in other regions, including the Gulf, new external data collection efforts that are aimed specifically at offshore wind, and that's extremely helpful. Then there's also the stuff that we as a company will do. So the site characterization surveys, the environmental and biological baseline surveys, and that's where we really get into partnerships with local academic institutions and local, sometimes very hyper-local ENGOs, and with groups like this, right? And so on the East Coast, we have worked with groups like the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance, to get at some of these sort of 4 sub-bullets there. So like the need for data standardization so that one developer's monitoring plan yields data that is comparable with another's. And so having a similar effort in the Gulf will be extremely useful for the standardization and for the synthesis and for the visualization. So a lot of the GCOOS things are right up that alley, right? I mean, that's extremely helpful to have those for a variety of reasons, including when I go to talk with the people that work at my company to explain something, having those materials is extraordinarily helpful. also definitely want to hit on the data sharing and management side, and coming to and having forums to have those conversations is extremely important. I've seen that from my experience on the East Coast of very well-intended research that becomes harder to talk to each other because those frameworks aren't there. So getting that in place early is really helpful. And then also just want to always hit on just how important cooperative research is. And when we think about, especially on like the environmental and biological survey side, how we, as a company like RWE, can form partnerships with people that are already doing that work, that have experience conducting that research. But also, I want to go back to the synthesis part, because I think that when we say data, it means just a million different things for us. Some of it's ours, some of it's not ours, some of it's regulatory, some of it is not as regulatory, but it is a part of some initiative we have that is more voluntary in nature. There's corporate sustainability goals that we have as a company that lead us to do some monitoring that exists outside of like a BOEM requirement. Then we have the G&G data. Then we have all of these other kinds of data. And there's all of the top two bullets there, the external things. I think a positive change I've seen is that there's thought given to how do we piece together different types of data, different surveys, different studies. How do we piece it together to get an overall picture? It might not be exactly apples to apples, but the analogy I like to use is it's also not necessarily apples to oranges. It's different types of apples. It's a Macintosh and a Golden Delicious or something like that, right? And so how do we work with partners to help with that synthesis to add up into an overall picture? And then when we need to do our site characterization and surveys and the biological baseline surveys, things like that, how do we standardize it so that it's easier to add that up into an overall picture? So I really appreciate your time. Again, sorry for my IT issues, but happy to hop on the panel with everybody else and hopefully answer some questions.
Great, thank you, Joel. So unfortunately with the time change, Tashara has a flight to catch, and so you may see her drop off in a little bit. So if you have any specific questions for Tashara, please put them in the chat. And I already see hands up, so I'll go to the hands first before my questions. So I saw Stefan Howden from USM pop his hand up, and then I think Nan Walker has her hand up as well. So Stephen, do you want to go first?
Sure. This is a question I asked at Oceans, at an Oceans panel, but I didn't get to follow up because I got sick there. And that is, cabled observatories are pretty rare because they're so expensive. And these offshore wind farms have cables with power and communications. And I wanted to see what was the possibility of nodes on these cables for undersea observatories.
Does anybody want to kind of jump in on that one in terms of the fiber optics? I know, and certainly personal views on the panel.
Thank you, Ruth. Joel, do you want to take that?
You can go for it, Dan. You can go for it, Daniel. If I have anything to add, I'll hop in after you.
Stephen, you know, this is one of the things I love about interacting cross communities like this, is there's always a treasure trove of great ideas, and that is one of them. However, I mean, that's always the unfortunate part. The however is there's a challenge there, as I understand it, with insurability of the cable and the infrastructure, i.e., the turbine, the foundation, what have you. And that's why I was asking Joel if he's come across any novel changes or changes in the way the developers are thinking about that. Because what I would also just reinforce, this is almost going to be like every every answer to every question. The past can inform where we're going on the West Coast and where we're going on the Gulf of Mexico and what might happen in the Gulf of Maine, but it's not a predictor of the future. You know, we can, and Joel's comments, I already heard some really nice evolutions of developer thinking informed by the cost, the schedule delays, and probably some of the frustrations that they experienced in the last 5 to 7 years. So, a great idea. I think it's technically doable, but the question is there a mechanism of insurability or unintended financial impacts to the wind farm? Joel, is that? Do you want to
Yeah, I
jump
think
in?
that generally aligns. I mean, I think I would file that possibility under like really interesting and a lot of promise. That's a little bit further off with more uncertainty than others, but it's definitely something that we've talked about and had, has seen come up on different meetings as well. But yeah.
Stephen, I would jump in and say that if like maybe not a node on a cabled observatory, but imagine like all of the offshore platforms that are in the Gulf right now. They're streaming current data, for example, through the lowered ADCP work. Shell Stones comes to mind on a way that there's a history infrastructure development that's supporting public science. Maybe there's other sensors that are a little less challenging to insurers.
One quick thing I would add, not specific to the technology asked about there, but there have been states that in the solicitation for offshore wind, so when you sign a purchase agreement with the state, they have required there to be a description of how you would use the infrastructure as a monitoring platform, essentially. So just if only from being a platform, but then also things like that or other possibilities. So there have been some states that have been looking at that, like you're gonna go build this wind farm. How do you use it as a platform for monitoring?
Yeah, I think interestingly, New Jersey put that in their last solicitation around trying to move that conversation forward with projects they have awarded serving as platforms of opportunity. I will say from the cable too, we're required to bury cables, doesn't always make it the easiest to do the fiber optic work depending on the type of sensors. So right now there is a view that all inter-array export cables are buried and have to remain buried, and so that adds some additional complexity into that. Tashara, did you want to add anything?
No, I didn't have anything. Thank you, though.
So Nan, I saw, did your hand go back down? Go to the list. I think I see Frank Muller-Carter has his hand up, so we'll go to Frank next.
I think Stefan was first.
I think he's trying to put his hand down.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you, Dan, Joel, and Tashara for the conversation. I'm one of the co-leads of something called the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, and one of our goals is to talk about standards and get the community to bring around biological observations into the ocean observing system. And so I was curious, Joel, when you mentioned that you're seeking ideas on standards or maybe using it, and how do you mobilize data on the biological components of the habitat into an interoperable framework. So we'd like to help with that. That's one of the things that we do with GCOOS and the IUS regional associations.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I really appreciate it because it is, like I said, when I started doing this in 2020 and saw some of those efforts run up against issues of standardization and the data sharing side, it took longer to try to fix it later, and it was frustrating. So doing it early is really important. So there's two things that jump to mind. So on the environmental and biological, especially on the biological baseline surveys, that group, the RWSC on the East Coast, the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, I participate in that, and then I participate in it's not as formal yet, but on the West Coast, there's a more informal group of so there's 5 lease areas on the West Coast. So those 5 developers and then a group of ENGOs working on this topic on the West Coast on that standardization. There's been some sort of white papers put forward on on methodology and data storage, things like that. So there are those precedents. The East Coast is more formal. The West Coast is sort of getting there, and that precedent or the concept of it then implemented with local partners, like you, I think is a good model for that. And so one of the reasons why it's useful for us, just from a practicality logistics standpoint, when we are writing a contract to have someone whoever it is, go get data for us, being able to put an external third-party guidance document into a contract, A, makes it easier, but B, makes it a lot more consistent. So as opposed to, me trying to think about like, oh, okay, what do I have to write in this contract for this person to go get this data? Being able to say, hey, here's the link to the document that we worked on in some sort of working group and all came to an agreement that that's how it should be managed. That is a very useful thing for us that I think ends up with better products.
Yeah, Joel, I wonder if GCOOS can help us connect with you in those groups, because there has been a tremendous amount of work done on standards for biological data in the last few years, and there's a lot of pickup in the research community that we'd like to walk over to the operational community or industry.
Yeah, that would be fantastic, and I'll make sure that my contact information gets to everybody, because those are exactly the kinds of conversations that we want to have.
Okay, that's a great point. Since we have Tashar for a few minutes, there is a question for her, so I want to make sure we get that in. Tashar, as you're probably aware, as in the case with the oil and gas industry operating in the Gulf of Mexico, there was a notice to lessee to provide current data from the ADCPs down to 1,000 meters. GCOOS actually took over that data stream from NDBC, and GCOOS is collecting, processing, and distributing that data. From your perspective, will wind energy operators have to submit metocean data to a data repository? Will that be a term and condition? Or are there other planned activities where there will be required data to be submitted to NOAA in the Gulf of Mexico?
Good question. So those were some of the thoughts that we were having when I was at BOEM, trying to figure out where and who's going to be housing this data for us. Oil and gas data, we had a whole group, resource evaluation, that actually houses that data and is proprietary for 25 years before that data can actually be released. So trying to understand where and who's going to house it is what's discussions that we were having. So it hadn't been determined before I left.
Tashar,
And I think what we're seeing.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just curious.
Please, Dan.
I was just curious, Tashara, if just in opinion, absolute opinion only.
Personal opinion, yes.
Personal opinions only. Why isn't the wind industry receiving NTLs? When and do you see them coming in the future? I mean, is that a good tool that developers should expect?
Yeah, I do see them coming in the future because there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. And, NTLs do not regulate, they help to inform. So I think this will be the better way to inform. I have to always say that even though I'm not a government employee, they do help. They don't regulate, they help to inform. So I think that would be more helpful if we did have NTLs that were put out for the community.
I asked that question just to make sure everyone's aware that currently there are no NTLs in place for offshore wind development. So.
Now, I will say this, in my personal opinion, it takes a long time, believe it or not, to get an NTL through the surnaming process. It doesn't take long to write, but it does take a while for it to get through the surnaming process for it to be put out. So I will put that out.
Great. Before you leave, Tashara, what other roles do you see IUCE playing in facilitating data sharing with the offshore wind industry?
I see it having a major role because, you know, BOEM kicked off the process of understanding what was out there as far as wind speeds with NREL, but still understanding hurricane paths, understanding, you know, past data from that is going to be key and critical as these projects move throughout their process. And so having all that data is going to be very important. Understanding, you know, definitely with foundations, because this is looking a little different than it is for the platforms. And so, yes, you may have a platform that, you know, has withstood hurricanes. What does that look like for a turbine sitting on top of a structure? So all of those things I think are going to be very key into going into these models and better understanding the best suitability for the Gulf.
Great. All right, Pat, over to you.
All right, thanks you all.
Thank you, Tashara.
That actually does segue into my question. I guess I have too many questions, but one was about the hurricane resilience of the structures themselves. I've heard things about folding blades so that they're, you know, they have the least amount of resistance to the direction of the hurricane force winds and things like that. Is that the case, or are they just going to be built so tough to standards that, you know, okay, they'll withstand 250-mile-an-hour wind? I don't know if that's it. That sounds really, really high. But that was my first question, is about hurricane resilience, because it's a Gulf of Mexico, right? So we all know what that means. The second one was about the life cycle time scale. I think it was about 10 years from the time you started looking at a block to the time you maybe had something in the water that was generating electricity. Or 10 years, maybe it's a little bit more. Is that time scale similar for the oil industry to stand up to develop a new field or something like that? Do they have to go through the same type of regulatory time frame and the same type of regulatory data collection requirements?
It's fine. I'm going to laugh because Tashara dropped off at a very convenient time and Daniel's nodding. So I will let him answer from his non-developer but supporting many developer perspective on the oil and gas and offshore wind space. But in short, the regulations were written under the Obama administration, and they were designed for probably a few small projects to come online, not commercial scale. And so when I say that, Pat, the BSEE side of the regulations were cleaved off, right? So BOEM typically does the leasing portion, auctioning, the upfront environmental work with NEPA. BSEE really does the enforcement and compliance piece. So there wasn't clear division of labor and authority. And so BOEM has really kind of taken that on, and right or wrongly has, you know, really emphasized these front-end data expectations under the NEPA process versus whether that's right or wrong for looking at how a project's designed, right? And so with the oil and gas industry, they took a much more regional approach to the NEPA process as well as BSEE, and there isn't necessarily the level of requirements or scrutiny with how plans to drill and develop were written, because those are more focused on the technical design safety criteria because they sit in BSEE's shop. Whereas BOEM did a lot of the data collection to inform the siting. They've essentially, for offshore wind, have put that on developers to provide them, requiring kind of this heavier upfront data collection. So that's kind of my like short answer and probably non-political answer, but Daniel may want to add some color as well.
No, Ruth, that was spot on. You know, Pat, my tongue-in-cheek response is if the U.S. can't figure out how to more rapidly install a wind turbine generator in the Gulf of Mexico, um,
Yeah.
we maybe really need to take a hard look at the reasons why. There is no oil and gas exploration on the East Coast. California has had oil and gas exploration, but and there's also positive. You know, Governor Newsom just signed a bill Friday, I believe, that is instructing some of the he's trying to legislate permitting efficiency in California for the arrival of offshore wind. So there's regional nodes of bottlenecks, but I would think that our ability to put steel in the water and in the ground and put a cable across, through the sediment,
Right.
we should be able to do that in the Gulf and do it not on the 10-year scale that you're seeing. So
Okay, that's cool. And it can be real quick, but the hurricane resistance to the turbines is it yeah, like I saw a talk one time where they said, well, we're gonna have a different blade design, or we're gonna have a folding blade design or something like that. But then I've also heard people say, well, we're just gonna engineer the what out of it and make it resistant so that it just isn't gonna go away.
I see an incredible future OTC Med Ocean or floating wind panel in the next couple of years on that topic. I don't
Okay.
know. I really, Joel, do you have a sense
Seems
of?
like a pretty important
Yeah,
consideration to take, to be thinking
it
about
is.
right
It is a really important consideration, and it's one of the questions that we get asked a lot in the Gulf, but also in other areas too. I mean, there's hurricanes that are pretty strong that have come through some of the areas on the East Coast as well, and so it's definitely an important question and one that we get. I think specific to the Gulf, where we are in the process, we have not made the sort of engineering decisions like you were talking about because it's just so new. But those are all things that we're looking at, and is a huge part. That safety aspect and like the protection of the infrastructure aspect is a big part of the COP development that Daniel was talking about. So even in other areas where that's less of a potential threat, there's a ton of time spent in the discussion in the COP, but also in the engineering on that. So I don't have a very satisfying definitive answer to give you today because we are so early, but it's definitely something that we're looking at. One quick thing I wanted to add on the timeline part and what Daniel was talking about with the recent legislation in California. When I've talked with folks out here being California about that, I've really said this is not the endeavor to make that the permitting part go faster is not being accomplished by having there be less oversight or less robust or rigorous inspection of what is a very big infrastructure project. It's on the administrative side, and it's on how do you get a piece of paper to these people more quickly than everybody has it in series, and it takes a long time for that piece of paper to go down the chain. Like, how do you functionally speed up the administrative side? It's that, not how do we, it's not removing oversight or review or things like that. It's just making it more efficient. And I think that's one of the real big opportunities to have things go more quickly.
Good point, Joel. That's a good clarification.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Yeah, so I'm monitoring the time, Jen. I think we're at the end, but I'll note that there is quite a bit of good chats and links, and it sounds like this might be a conversation we want to continue potentially into the spring meeting, Jorge, as this moves along. And I know that there's a lot of information coming out from IUs around effects, impacts, etc. Again, Tom also put a link in, hence why I stayed apolitical in my answer, because I think views on what data, how much data, what should be done gets more political than it should. Hence why I wanted to bring together these panelists, because I think under the political level, there's a lot of good collaborative work that's happening. And I'll point out a lot of adoption of what's come out of GCOOS with its relationship with the oil and gas industry that's been duplicated and reimagined in the Atlantic, including data sharing MOUs. RWE's also got a cooperating agreement with NIMS, so to do more focused around the monitoring. So I think there's opportunity for GCOOS to also interface across the NOAA enterprise and collaboratively bring collectively some of these conversations more forward. Because I will say these conversations are still happening in vacuums, depending on what type of data it is, what the requirement for that data is who it's being driven by. For instance, whether it's Endangered Species Act with NIMS or a science center under NIMS or IUs. So to Frank's point with biological data. So I think there's a lot of really great opportunity because GCOOS and GOMA have been on the forefront of regional conversations and have the connections across BOEM, BESI, NOAA, and stakeholders that, could even set some great opportunities as RWE comes in, potentially if a state opportunity is going to be developed in Louisiana and what future leasing should look like. So that long-winded conclusion to say thank you to the panelists, and certainly I think this is a hot topic to think about. How do we do better across the data sharing enterprise and put GCOOS in a position to serve that leadership role? So thank you, everybody. And I will make sure Jen has the contact information for Joel, Tishara, and Daniel and sends that out in our post summary.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up one quick thing with Frank. Frank, there's on the biological data, there's also a joint industry project with the oil and gas community on genomic standards. So eDNA as a biodiversity and a biological tool set, they're working on that fairly hard. And in the end of 23, I think we're going to start seeing some of their JIP standards come out. So there's another example of not having to reinvent the wheel for offshore wind to do the same thing. So that's a nice development that's happening.
Yeah, Dan, again, these regional associations like GCOOS are kind of in the middle of a process. You may know that the federal government is developing its own eDNA strategy right now, and I'm hoping that we are not reinventing, 24 wheels in parallel. And so it would be good to get some convergence on this.
Agreed. No, I appreciated your question. Thank you all.
Great, thank you. Kirsten, back to you.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks to the panel. I learned a lot about the data that's been pulled together, and so I'm actually excited to dive into that over the next few months. So I appreciate everybody's talks and insights and information, and thank you.